Ok, hello anh em. Hello anh em. Hello anh em. Hỏi em bị cái gì ấy? Property. Alo. Bình thường mà. À, à ok. 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 Hello anh em. Hello. Ok. Ok. Chắc là nghe rồi đấy. Nhưng mà hơi nhỏ nhỉ? Từ Alo. Từ từ để chỉnh lại nha. Property. Alo. Bình thường rồi nè. Alo. Ok. Hello anh em. À, ngồi chơi ARAM nhỉ? Ok. Ừm,
Welcome to and a repeat, getting everyone destroyed. Now my gameplay, you can obviously not see the cry because I started using it close to the Arbiter. I was so laid with the idea, hey, Inferno Cry could actually be good. Therefore, you're going to be faster than me going through all of this. I mean, look at this beautiful Viper fight, how she's absolutely getting demolished with a Whirling Assault.
Okay, we're not going to use normal rage hits. I'm going to activate this double bell. And now I'm hitting my bell and look at my rage, how my rage goes up, Chad. So just from hitting the belts. Therefore, technically, we don't need the hits anymore. Okay, we've one-faced Viper, chat, ladies and gentlemen. Success, let's go.
Before
Hey, I'm Mark. Let's talk about destruction. Let's talk about smashing cars and leveling buildings. Let's talk about terrain deformation and fire propagation. Let's talk about games where things can bend and break and blow up. But I'm not talking about those fancy pre-canned animations that play as part of a cutscene or a scripted moment. I'm not talking about buildings that fall down in the exact same way every single time. I'm talking about doing destruction in real time, in response to a player's actions, as part of the gameplay. That's a whole nother thing. That's really hard. And it's hard because you're dealing with unpredictable physics and particles and lumps of debris, and if you're not careful, you'll tank the frame rate. And so that's what I find so interesting about this topic. Doing dynamic destruction in games is about being clever. It's about using cost-cutting algorithms and outright magic tricks to blow up the world without blowing your memory budget. So in this video, I want to look at 6 games that have done destruction in wildly different ways and reveal the ingenious techniques that they've used to make their worlds fall apart. I'm Mark Brown, this is Game Maker's Toolkit, and here's how games do destruction. Okay, let's start with Control. This is a game where the environment just falls to pieces as you play. Your bullets rip through tables and chairs, and you can use Jesse's telekinetic powers to rip chunks of concrete out of the wall. Now, this is perhaps the most common kind of destruction in games. Almost every shooter is filled with props and small objects that can be broken upon impact. And they all use, basically, the same technique. You store 2 versions of the object in memory, an intact one and a broken one. And then when the object is attacked, you replace A with B. It's simple, but it totally works. And Control uses the same idea, it just takes it a lot further. For one, objects are made up of loads of individual pieces that can all be destroyed independently. That means objects can break at almost the exact point where you attack them. And because those broken pieces are distinct physics objects that are connected with joints, well, if you break a table in half, then the table will fall into 2 parts and collapse in a realistic way. The game will also play a particle effect when the object breaks to cover up the transition. Props are tagged with different materials like metal, concrete, and wood, and will then play a specific effect on impact. And finally, decals are used to really sell the impact. Decals are basically stickers that you can slap on the environment, like bullet holes and craters, and Control has some really good ones that trick you into thinking that you just made an actual dent in the wall. Put all of this together and you get an environment that is chaotically crumbling around you in a truly satisfying way. Next, let's talk about Astrobot. So I just said that the way to do destruction is to secretly prepare a broken version of whatever object you want to destroy. But it turns out that you don't have to fake the fracture. So in Astrobot, there are these logs that you can cut with your little laser tootsies to make smaller logs. And they seem to cut exactly where you damage them. What's going on there? Does the game just have thousands of possible variants of this log tucked away in memory, ready to swap out? Turns out, no. The game actually projects a flat 2D plane underneath Astrobot and literally divides the 3D model at the place where you cut it. It then adds new edges and surfaces, creates new collision shapes, and then spits out two models to represent the cut logs, all in a single frame. This is also how Rainbow Six Siege lets you shoot through walls. It slices up the model in real time. It's the tech behind Hard Space Shipbreaker, a game where you use a big-ass cutting laser to slice up bits of spaceship. And it was even being used in Red Faction back on the PlayStation 2 to dynamically cut spheres out of the walls. Now this turns out to be quite expensive on the hardware, so it comes with limitations. It only works on simple shapes, and the games will typically hide the broken pieces after some time to avoid clogging up your memory. But still, in certain circumstances, you can do the destruction in real time instead of preparing it in advance. Next up, BeamNG. Okay, so physics objects in games typically use something called rigid body physics, which means they always retain their exact rigid shape. But other games use soft body physics to create something more malleable and bouncy. It's the technology behind squishy games like World of Goo and Jellycar Worlds. And this idea can be scaled up to create a realistic vehicle, as seen in BeamNG.drive, which can lead to extremely detailed and realistic deformation. Here's how it works. Every car in BeamNG is made up of a bunch of nodes, just floating points in space, and then they're held together with beams, which act like stiff springs that try not to stretch. So when one of those nodes is moved by a collision, it will yank on all of the connected beams, which pull in all of their nodes, creating that realistic, crumpled effect. And so where most racing games just use shaders and textures to represent damage in a purely visual way, soft body games like BeamNG and Wreckfest can literally squish and squash the model of the car to fundamentally change how the object moves and interacts with the environment. Now there's so much more to BeamNG, like aerodynamics and fuel consumption and so on, but most people just use it to recreate that one scene from Final Destination. Okay, let's go to Far Cry 2. This game is famous for its fire propagation system. In this game, a Molotov cocktail can set fire to a patch of dry grass, and it will spread into a raging inferno that will engulf nearby trees and buildings. How does that work? Well, basically, the game world is represented by an invisible grid that stretches over the floor, and each cell has a certain number of hit points. If the cell is flammable and loses all of its hit points, say when you shoot a rocket at it, it will set on fire. Then a burning cell will start to damage its neighbouring cells, and when their HP reaches 0, they'll set on fire too, creating a chain reaction that will make the fire spread from zone to zone. There are other bits of nuance to the system, of course. Each cell has a finite lifetime, so it will eventually stop burning. Different environments will have more or fewer hit points to represent, say, a dry patch of grass versus a wet jungle. The more hit points it has, the harder it is to set alight. And burning cells will deal more damage to neighbours that are in the direction of the wind to capture the effect of a fire being corralled by a strong gust. It's a deceptively simple system, but it creates a really strong effect. Next up, Teardown. But first, let's start by looking at 2D games. So in a game like Spelunky, we can see that the world is divided into a grid of tiles. Then we can create a simple destruction system by removing those tiles to create tunnels, pathways, and chutes. The devs can just swap out the sprites of the neighbouring tiles to hide the rough edges. And if you want more fidelity in your destruction, you can just reduce the size of the grid. In fact, you can go all the way down to destroying individual pixels, as seen in Noita. In this game, every single pixel can be removed in order to dig through walls and floors with practically infinite granularity. And so, if we take that grid of tiles and extend it into an extra dimension, we get, well, Minecraft. Minecraft is built out of cubes called voxels, which can be independently added and subtracted from the world to allow for completely free-form destruction. And in fact, a lot of games use this voxel approach for destruction, including No Man's Sky, 7 Days to Die, Astroneer, and the terrain-smashing Donkey Kong Bonanza, where every layer is made up of hundreds of cubes that are packed together like dirt. Most of these games use some kind of smoothing technique or algorithm to avoid that super blocky Minecraft style in favour of something more naturalistic. Check out this video on marching cubes for more info if you're feeling technical. And then, just like how we went from Spelunky to Noita by reducing the size of the blocks, we can do the same in 3D to get a game like Teardown. Teardown is basically Minecraft but with way higher resolution. Where Minecraft represents a piece of furniture as a single cube, Teardown represents it as hundreds or thousands of tiny blocks, all of which allows for much more precise destruction. Though the other difference with the other voxel-based games is that Teardown has physics. There are no floating platforms here. Basically, the game makes objects from a cluster of voxels, but if some of those voxels get loose from the cluster, they are instantly turned into a new rigid body physics object, separate from the original. This means it can fall down, hit into other objects, and roll around. And then, finally, it's the reigning champion of video game destruction, Red Faction Guerrilla. This is a game where almost every structure on the Martian surface can be brought down with an explosive, or just a big swing of your trusty hammer. This is a game where buildings react realistically when you remove their foundations, and can even fall down and crush other structures in the process. Now, there are other games where you can destroy buildings. We just saw it in Teardown. There are small structures in the Just Cause games that you can topple, and there's fan favourite Battlefield Bad Company 2. In this game, buildings are made out of a large number of prefabricated pieces, each with two versions, an intact one and a destroyed one. And when you do enough damage, it will, you know the trick, swap the piece out for its destroyed variant. So that's all cool, but all of these games struggle with a fundamental question. When does the building fall down? Because Teardown does it when the object is completely detached from the ground. But that means massive buildings can be held up by a single strand of voxels. And Bad Company does it after a certain number of those prefab pieces are destroyed, at which point it plays a pre-canned destroyed animation. But that all feels kinda arbitrary. Ideally, we'd want to perform some kind of structural analysis to see if the building should stay standing or whether it should fall. And that is exactly what Red Faction does, with a system that developer Volition calls stress. Here's how it works. So, a building in Red Faction is made up of hundreds of individual parts that you can destroy. Let's think of them like bricks. And then each brick has two stats. Its force, which, for simplicity's sake, let's just think of it as how heavy that part is, and its strength, how much mass it can hold up. We can then group all of the bricks into individual layers. For a simple building, that will be a bunch of horizontal tiers like a big stack of pancakes, but it can be more complicated for horizontal structures like bridges and overhangs. Then we can tally up the stats on those bricks to get each layer's combined weight and strength, keeping in mind that the weight must also include everything above it. And now we can do a stress calculation by simply asking, is the strength of one layer greater than the weight of all the layers above it. Now, a building is designed by Volition to be architecturally sound and hold up its own weight, with different values for different materials. So, a giant supporting concrete pillar has a much higher strength value than a pane of glass. But as we start destroying bricks, we're reducing the strength of that layer. And we can keep going until the strength is now less than the force of everything above it, at which point the layer will fail and everything above it will turn into a bunch of physics objects that can come crashing down. In fact, if you go frame by frame, you can see the exact moment where the upper layers change from static stuff to floppy physics bits. And because those physics objects can inflict damage themselves, we can get into a situation where the top layer of the building will fall down and crush the layers beneath it, or even fall to the side and make a big hole in the building next to it. Super satisfying. Now, there are plenty of limitations to this system. The game takes a while to actually do the stress calculation, which is why buildings sometimes take a while to fall down. But still, this technique allowed for an unmatched level of realism, detail, and player freedom, and that's despite it being over a decade old and running on a PlayStation 3. Which I think all goes to prove what I said at the start, that destruction is about ingenuity. It's not a problem that you can solve by just throwing more processing power at it. Right? Well, that is true, but what if we took Red Faction's stress system and just added on the last 10 years of software and hardware advancements? Well, then you'd get the finals. Yeah, this is a multiplayer arena shooter a la Overwatch, but with truly absurd levels of destruction. Every building can be busted, blown up, bifurcated, and turned into bits. Over the course of a match, the game world will crumble to pieces in reaction to rockets, mines, and explosive barrels. And it's even possible to level the entire playspace. And the thing is, the system is basically identical to Red Faction. The developers were directly inspired by Volition's work, and so they made a very similar setup. The buildings are made up of hundreds of fractured parts, the game calculates stress in real time, and if a layer's force exceeds its strength, then the whole thing comes down. Except it's now running on Unreal Engine 5 with NVIDIA PhysX, and the min spec asks for 20 times more memory than you'd find on an Xbox 360. So, those are some of the most effective techniques used for adding destruction to games. Swapping props, splitting the world into breakable cubes, and performing quick stress tests on buildings, all of which can make for an impressive imitation of real-world destruction. And now you know the tricks. On the last episode of Game Dev 101, my series about the indie game production pipeline, I shared a whole bunch of tips for coming up with ideas for games. Earlier this month, we held the 9th annual GMTK Game Jam, which is, well, you know the drill by now. A game-making marathon where people race to make a game in just 4 days, and that game must fit within a specific theme. As always, we saw even more people enter the jam than last year, with more than 37,000 participants making over 9,600 games, which means that it's still the biggest jam in itch.io history, and boy, do their servers feel it. So, what was this year's theme? Well, it was a single word: loop. And so we saw thousands of games about programming loops, about musical loops, about running loops around people, about loops in time and in space. The way you all managed to take this theme and spit out so many distinctly clever, imaginative and fun games, well, it's absolutely inspiring. And now it's time for me to pick my 20 favourite games from the jam. Pause the video right there. Normally this is where I'd say I'm choosing the best games from the jam, or even the winners of the jam, but the truth is, as GMTK Game Jam grows bigger and bigger, I don't think it makes sense for the whole thing to come down to a single judge who really likes puzzle platformers. especially when I've only played like 1% of the total entries. So from now on, I'll let the community pick the winners through rating and ranking the games. You can see those over on itch.io, but I will simply choose some personal favourites. That cool? Cool. Back to the video. Let's start with Rhythmetric. This is a game about a circle who fights rather more pointy shapes using laser beams, dodges, and shields. But it's up to you when those moves are triggered. You see, there's a track on the right side of the screen, and here you can plop down moves at different points. Then, when the looping indicator scrolls along the track, it will play each move on the beat. This turns your fighting style into a personalized anthem. Attack, 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 shield, dodge, dodge, dodge. You know, simply by feel, when it's time to aim at the enemies and unleash a barrage, and when it's time to swing the mouse in the opposite direction to dodge away. It turns the player into a deadly DJ, mixing between fighting and composing, and then as you pick up more beats and add to the track, the game naturally gets more complex. It's addictive, smart, and puts you into a dizzying, zen-like state. The next game, Vood Loop, has a somewhat similar premise. This time though, it's a 2D platformer, and we can assign moves like jump, kick, and dash, which will then trigger on the beat. So you'll need to build the right loop to do double jumps over pits or to fight simple enemies. What I really like about the game though is that each level is like a miniature Metroidvania. You must hunt for new moves to lay down on the track, which then lets you access new areas in order to find new moves so you can reach the exit and do it all over again. Also, by changing the style and tempo of each level's soundtrack, the game takes on a very different feel from stage to stage. Super smart stuff, with a rather dashing, chunky pixel art visual style. With a theme like Loop, we were bound to see a few entries inspired by the ultimate time loop game, Outer Wilds. But my favourite of the bunch is Night O'Clock, a quick-fire murder mystery where you have just 1 minute to scour a mansion, collect clues, and gather knowledge before time's up and you have to start again. A clever twist on the formula is that you keep hold of any item you've got when time runs out, so you have to think carefully about, say, which key you want in your hand before restarting the loop. Night O'Clock is absurdly polished for a game made in 4 days, and it kept me wrapped for the entire runtime. An easy recommendation among a sea of games about repeating the same day over and over. Now, game ideas can come from the weirdest places. Like, what about that shower thought of, if you plug a power strip into itself, wouldn't that give you an infinite energy source? Well, forget conservation of energy and other boring realities. In this game, you can cheat physics and unlock an eternal electrical source. But it's more than a meme. This is actually a very clever, mind-bending puzzle game. You need to understand a simple set of rules about where power comes from and where it goes. Deal with restrictions like the short length of your cables, and think outside the box as you make temporary connections and purposefully undo your actions to make everything work. It made my brain hurt, but like in a nice, fuzzy way. Talk about thinking outside of the box. When developer SI Interactive heard the theme Loop, they thought about the looping lasso tool in Photoshop. And so we get a game about being a freelance photo editor. Each day you get a request in your inbox. Can you take this photo of me and add hair? Can you block out my ex? Can you add friends to my birthday party? You can then use the loop to select stickers, people, and cartoon characters to place into the photo, send it back, and hope the client is happy. There's even a hint of detective work in here, as your clients ask you to figure out relationships from their email. It's only a sprinkle, but you could see this being expanded into a clever deduction game where you provide your answer through doctored digital images. But as for the game that's actually here, it's cute, clever, and as someone who spends their life selecting crap in Photoshop, it was nice to play a game where my pointless life skills are finally validated. Circuit Breaker starts out as a pretty simple puzzle platformer. Walk, jump, manipulate machines, plop batteries into sockets. But when you finally make it to the far end of the room, you into a series of single-screen vignettes. You play loops, where the sum is performed over